About 20 years ago, I went on a camping trip with my friend Christian. At that time, we were both around 21 years old. To get to the camping site, deep in the forest, we rode together in Christian's car. When we arrived, it was early evening, and we had a great time fishing and grilling meat. I went to sleep soon after we ate, but I woke up in the middle of the night because I needed a pee. I opened the tent and went outside. My eyes were drawn up to the bright moonlight, walked over to the tree line, and believed myself looking around to make sure nothing was nearby. As I was zipping up my pants, I saw a large dark silhouette moving in the forest. I thought for a moment that it was a bear, and I was gripped by fear. When I looked closely, it slowly became more visible in the darkness. It looked like a human figure, but it was incredibly big. He slowly approached me when he came out of the forest and was illuminated by the moonlight. I could make out his appearance. He was at least twice my size and had a huge angular face like a primitive man. He was covered in fur and not wearing any clothes. More noticeable than anything else was that he was making a strange sound that I had never heard before. It was like a sharp sound made by strongly scraping his vocal cords. Every time I heard it, I felt goosebumps race across my whole body. His face was clearly a human face. And although it was hard to see because it was covered in fur, it looked like he was smiling in his hands. He was holding large rocks. They were massive, around the size of basketballs. He was holding each of the enormous rocks with one hand. He didn't look to be straining at all, like they weren't heavy at all. To him, he approached me slowly. I asked him who he was and what he needed. But he didn't seem to understand me. He seemed to be mumbling something, but it didn't sound like language. I felt an inexplicable sense of despair and fear rising from my stomach. The instant I looked into his eyes, my whole body became paralyzed before I could even think of anything. Every cell in my body was overcome by fear. I had enough time to run to the tent, but my body wouldn't move. Looking back now, I think I already instinctively knew at that moment that there was nothing I could do. His physical ability was several times greater than mine, so even if I ran, he could catch up to me in a matter of seconds. And I knew that if I ran, I would provoke him even more. So there was nothing I could do. He was finally close enough to touch me. He looked at me curiously and felt the flesh on my arm, and then he pressed hard on my stomach with the back of his hand. It seemed as if he wanted to know what was inside my stomach. I pushed his hand away with everything in me, but he didn't move. He was like a statue. Meanwhile, Christian seemed to be sleeping soundly in the tent, funnily enough. At that moment, I felt that even if I got eaten by that monster, I wanted Christian to survive. I wasn't a coward. I was a normal adult male. But I felt so small in front of that huge man. The creature in front of me didn't have the feel of a human standing before him. It was like being in front of a bear or a lion. I kept asking him what he wanted, but he didn't respond. Then after a while, he frowned and circled around me. He was still holding the rocks in his hands. I couldn't take my eyes off him for a second because I was afraid that he would hit me with a rock. Of course, I also simulated it countless times in my head. I imagined launching a surprise attack on him while he looked away from me. However, I had a gut feeling that he wouldn't budge, even if I punched him. That's how big and strong he was. He circled around me once more, and then slowly started to move away and finally seemed to lose interest in me. My head was dizzy as I watched him move away. I guess I was so scared that I couldn't breathe properly. He suddenly started running incredibly fast and disappeared into the forest. As I had Inuit, his motor skills were several times greater than a human's, and his running speed was so fast that my eyes could barely keep up. I walked over to Christian's tent and woke him up. I told him what happened to me, but he seemed incredulous. But when he smelled that horrible stench coming from me and saw that I was drenched in sweat, he understood that something had really happened. We quickly packed up and drove away. I still don't know what the human or creature I saw that day was. What did he want from me? Was he trying to eat me? The answers to many of my questions will remain unanswered, and I have never gone camping again since that day. Unfortunately, or I should say fortunately, this story is short. It was about 4 years ago. I'll keep the location vague for the sake of anonymity, but I will say it was in the northern half of Louisiana. I've lived here pretty much my whole life, and the few things I've ever experienced before this were at my father's house in Texas when I was younger. But that can be its own story anyway. I lived in an apartment complex about 30 to 40 minutes from where I worked. I was part of the evening shift at my job. At the time, I would have to drive down a long, mostly empty road heading towards my home. This would last about 10 minutes before I had to head down a smaller, more rural, suburban, urban area. This is where it happened. It was probably a little past 11, or maybe even midnight, the usual time I got off for where I used to work. I was just driving, listening to either music or a podcast. I don't remember which. I was just really tired from work. I was relaxing and driving when my headlights illuminated something off to my right in the ditch. Along the road, I only saw it for a few seconds, but I swear this pale creature, probably about 6 feet long, if not more, was sprawled out on the ground, crawling up out of the ditch, flat on its stomach. I only caught a glimpse, but I sometimes remember it having 6 limbs, other times 4. As I said, I was trying to pay more attention to the road, not expecting something like this. Either way, it startled me. I remember vividly seeing movement as I passed by, like it had crawled out of the drainage pipe and was about to head into the yard of the house I was passing. One of its long, thin, and lanky limbs reached up to place its right hand to pull itself up further. I passed it fast and did a double take, questioning what I'd seen. My mind was wondering if what I saw was real, or was I just tired my mind playing tricks on me? Either way, I was not dumb enough to think about turning around to check it out all the way back home. I kept driving and told myself it was just the weird way my headlights were making shadows. And the rocks in the ditch, I even tried to recreate this effect for days, trying multiple ideas to recreate that effect. But never did the shadows ever look the same as what I'd seen that night. Even trying to look out of the corner of my eyes, nothing. I asked my coworkers the following days if they'd ever seen anything like what I described. But to my dismay, they brushed it off, joking and asking, "Did you also see Bigfoot too?" I wish I could say I saw it again, but I didn't. But honestly, I'm glad. It means I can keep telling myself it had nothing to do with anything but my imagination even. So a small part of my mind says otherwise. The best description I have for what I saw that night are those things I've heard of about crawlers. Heck, I even started to follow groups online that talk about sightings like that. Now, I've told a few people about this. Most folks brush it off, to be honest. I still hope it was nothing more than my headlights and shadows. But you can never be too sure if it really is out there. Please, never let me see you again, ever. Hi, I'm a 12th grade graduate, but this incident takes me back to my 9th grade days when something really strange happened at our school. Imagine this. It was a normal day, and we were in the middle of our 3rd period. Out of nowhere, 2 senior girls whose classroom was down the hall burst into our classroom, tears streaming down their faces. They were terrified and told our teacher, who had also been their teacher, that one of their classmates had tried to choke them in the girls' washroom. Our teacher wasted no time and rushed to the scene to investigate. They hurried to the washroom only to find that the accused girl had somehow managed to get back into her classroom. The situation was chaos. The room was a complete mess with books and pens scattered everywhere. The other students in her class were forced to leave, frightened and confused, not daring to go back inside. Now here's where things get really weird. While all of this was happening, I was sitting in my classroom with my classmates thinking we were safe, but our curiosity got the best of us, and we couldn't resist peeking out to see what was happening in the seniors' classroom. Little did we know we were about to witness something truly disturbing. As the teachers arrived, they discovered that the troubled girl had barricaded herself inside her classroom, refusing to open the door, worried about her well-being. They immediately reached out to her mother, who shared the alarming news that her daughter had been struggling with mental health issues. She promised to come and take her daughter home. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity as we all waited anxiously. Finally, after what felt like ages, the teachers managed to force the door open as the walks were a bit loose, revealing a scene that sent shivers down our spines. There she sat, calm and composed on the ground. But here's the strange part. All the desks had been stacked up one on top of another, forming a towering pile. These were not ordinary desks. They were heavy wooden desks that required the strength of 3 people to move. How on earth did she manage to stack them all by herself? It was baffling when her mother arrived. The girl remained silent, not uttering a single word. They quickly took her to the hospital, where it was later discovered that she had a brain disorder that caused hallucinations and erratic behavior. It was a heartbreaking revelation that shed some light on the bizarre events we had witnessed even to this day. I can't forget that incident. I still question how a seemingly fragile girl could possess such strange strength and perform such a chilling act. It serves as a reminder that there are depths to the human mind that we may never fully understand, and horrors that can emerge from within. And with this incident, I owe a debt of gratitude to my friend that day. You see, I had a strange urge to use the washroom and asked my friend to come along for a quick chat. But she insisted we wait until the next period. Little did I know that her decision may have saved me from crossing paths with that troubled girl. It sends shivers down my spine when I imagine what might have happened. I've been working as a police officer for more than 15 years in San Diego, California. More specifically, I was a police cane holder. There were some moments on the job where it was rough, but one moment made me see how excruciating the job really is. On March 3rd, 2022, at approximately 12:30 a.m., San Diego Police Department, which I was working at, received a request for urgent cover from the Sheriff's Department at a residence that was not too far from where we were. The request was that there was a woman who had been given paperwork because she had quite a bit of eviction notices. When the deputies tried to talk with the woman and tried to give her the paperwork, they saw a big knife in her hand. She wasn't listening, and she slammed her front door and shut it, and she barricaded it. That's when me, along with other police officers, were called for backup. When we got to the given address, I, along with the Can 9 unit, were told to wait outside of the lobby in case we were needed, which we were later called to enter the unit as an additional, less lethal option. We got to the air and one of the deputies broke down the door. I and some other officers walked through the door and we went inside of the apartment. We were all calling for her to come out with her hands up, but she wouldn't listen. We were able to see the woman in the room with an open door and one deputy officer named Jason. He kept shooting warning shots to the wall for her to obey and not to do this the hard way, right? In an instant, we saw a woman charging at us with a knife. We were backing up and out into the hallway, and Jason kept trying to shoot her, but he kept missing when this didn't work. The woman swung the knife at us, which happened to land on my chest for a second or two, and then it was taken out. This prompted one of the other officers to shoot the woman. She was struck at least once, and she immediately was killed on the scene. I could barely move now. I was in so much pain, I screamed out that I got stabbed. But it seemed like no one acknowledged me just yet. Then like 5 seconds later, an officer asked if anyone was hurt, and I yelled out that I got stabbed once again. I was immediately rushed to the hospital, and I knew I wasn't going to die. I was fortunate enough to get treated for my stab wounds, and not too long after I was released from medical center, I soon found out that the woman who stabbed me and got shot and killed was a 47-year-old woman. She was named Yan Lee. She had been getting a lot of eviction notices, but she kept refusing to accept it. She also apparently threatened one of the maintenance workers with a knife the previous day before she died. I was able to move on from this incident, but I'll never forget the feeling of having so much pain in your body that you think that you might not make it out alive. That's just the adventures of being a cop. Music guess. This chilling true story happened to my sister 5 years ago. Back then, we were both quite paranoid and gullible little kids and had no idea about the world's real dangers. But thanks to the safety of our town, we never really had to experience anything genuinely scary. It didn't really have a huge population back then. Everyone knew each other in the neighborhoods, and the atmosphere was peaceful and worry-free. There were no robberies, no illegal activities, no problems whatsoever. As far as I was concerned, that's why this event shook me completely. My sister and one of her former best friends, who I'll be calling Becky, were going for a walk with my dog on their usual route. It was getting really late. The street lamps were pretty much the only thing illuminating the dark street, and our dog was feeling very thirsty, so they decided to take a shortcut back to our house. This particular shortcut went through dense trees and bushes, and of course it had to pass by the cemetery. We were always cautious about taking this path because it was very slippery after rain, but as this happened during summer, there was no cause for concern. Our dog never likes to stay behind others, so this time she charged forward, and my sister and her friend had to pick up the pace to keep up. As they were getting closer to the end of the shortcut, the cemetery became more visible and more visible. Becky looked around and noticed something very strange, which made her stop in her tracks. A woman in a white dress was sitting on her knees in front of a grave. Becky tapped my sister on her shoulder and pointed her finger towards the woman. Now they both stopped to look, but weirdly enough, my dog just wanted to continue walking. It was very unusual to see people there since the cemetery closes before dark, and the visibility in there was extremely low without another light source, and she didn't have one. As cautious and silly kids, they continued to stare, but eventually, as nothing happened, they continued walking. Finally reaching the end of the path, Becky looked at the lady just one more time, and to her horror, she was standing and seemed to be staring off into the distance. She once again warned my sister about what she was seeing, and they both stopped to watch the woman again. My dog seemed to be unbothered, so she just sat down and waited for them to start walking again. Minutes passed and nothing happened. But they were scared to move. My sister eventually had enough, looked away and whistled to our dog to stand up and begin walking. Just then, the woman turned around, broke out of the cemetery and started running towards them at an insane speed. This is where I come into the story. Both of our parents were asleep by then. I had stayed up to play video games and to make sure everyone would arrive okay while running. My sister calls me, open the front door now, and wake up mom and dad. What happened? There's a woman chasing us. I think we lost her, but I immediately rushed to our parents' room and woke them up, told them everything, and opened the front gate. I put on my slippers and ran outside to see where they could be. I thankfully saw them in the distance. They were okay. We all went inside and talked things through. My dad took Becky back to her house while my sister told me. And my mom everything. There was a lot of scolding after that. But it was totally fair. She said that after the lady began the pursuit, They all ran as fast as they could, trying not to stumble on anything. Becky was able to look back at the woman and see her move clearly when she was under the street lamps. She said she ran so unnaturally and never stumbled once, even though she was supposedly in heels and the white dress didn't have any stain. It was completely clean. Nothing made sense about her. But the freakiest thing of all was that our dog, who acts extremely aggressively against any kind of threats due to accidents with other dogs in the past, never barked, growled, or seemingly saw her at all. To this day, I have no idea if this was something related to the supernatural. Nothing else happened after this occurrence. But my sister sometimes still has nightmares about her encounter with this woman. Sometimes the woman even catches up to her, but she always wakes up before what happens next. Even now, when I think about that time, it feels so horrible. I've tried to live without thinking about it again because when I do, I feel so terrified that I can't do anything. But for the sake of sharing this story, I'll recall that hellish time one last time. It was 6 years ago when I met a man named Cameron. At first, I thought he was a good person. He ran a flower shop and always carried flowers with him. But when I found out why he liked flowers so much, it was already too late. I started dating him, and every time we met, he gave me a bouquet of flowers. The flowers were always of the best quality. They were all beautiful and carefully selected one day. As he handed me a bouquet, he picked out a few flowers and broke them. Confused, I asked him why he said they're not pretty. I get angry when I see ugly things. His expression suddenly turned murderous. I was startled by the change in his face and froze. Then he looked at me and said, "Why, you're pretty, don't worry. I won't break you." As he said this, he grabbed my shoulder. His hand felt unnaturally strong. I remembered how he often did arm exercises with dumbbells when there weren't any customers in the shop. Suddenly, I started to feel scared of him. Seeing the fear in my face, he leaned in and whispered, quite quietly, "All you have to do is stay pretty without withering. So please smile. You look ugly with that frowning expression." Then he smiled brightly again and handed me a bottle of water. "Your skin needs hydration. Drink water," he said. That's when I realized he was a psychopath. Goosebumps covered my skin, and I decided I needed to end things with him immediately before our next date. I called 2 friends, Adam and Jonathan, and asked them to watch me from a distance and to help if anything goes wrong. I explained the situation and they agreed to help. They waited in their car near Cameron's house ready to intervene when I gave them the signal. When I arrived at Cameron's doorstep, I rang the doorbell. He told me to come inside, but I refused to enter. He came to the front door, confused, and asked me what was wrong. That's when I told him we needed to break up. For a moment, he seemed surprised and stood silently for about 5 seconds. Then with a bitter smile, he said, "When you say that you look so ugly right now," slowly he raised his hands and grabbed my neck. His grip was incredibly strong. "You were such a pretty flower." He said, "Why did you suddenly change?" "I told you I didn't want to break your neck." He loosened his grip slightly and whispered softly, "I'll give you one last chance. Do you really want to break up with me? Or will you be my flower again?" with a trembling voice. I told him we should break up. Suddenly he screamed, "I'll kill you," grabbing my head with both hands. He started breathing heavily, as if mentally preparing to snap my neck. I screamed for help as loud as I could. At that moment, Adam and Jonathan heard my screams. They ran to me, tackled Cameron to the ground, and restrained him while calling the police. Cameron was arrested, and I later learned that he had done the same thing to his ex-girlfriends. One of his ex-girlfriends had her neck snapped and she barely survived. Cameron had used his wealth to pay her a huge settlement and avoid severe punishment. This time, Cameron went to prison, and I was lucky to escape with my life. 5 years later, I received even more horrifying news. A friend of Cameron's contacted me and told me that after he was released from prison, he killed another woman and was sentenced to life in prison. Apparently, he had found a new girlfriend one day. They had a fight, and he snapped her neck. Afterward, he called his friend crying and said, "I broke a flower" when the police arrived. They found the woman's body in a bathtub full of water, her neck completely broken. Cameron was pouring water over her head and stroking her hair. When I heard that story, I was so shocked that I had to see a psychiatrist for a while. Even now, I often wonder what would have happened to me if Adam and Jonathan hadn't been there that day. They saved my life, and I will never forget how grateful I am to them. My name is Nela Morales, and today I'll be telling you a story that still haunts me to this very day. I was about 10 to 11 years old. Me and my friends are on a hiking trip to explore the woods personally. I wasn't a fan of hiking, but I went along because I wanted to hang out with my friends. At one point, my friend, will call her Cassie, and I had to pee, so our friends found a public restroom nearby in the woods that looked pretty abandoned. I, of course, was a bit hesitant at first because it was slightly eerie, but Cass saw me starting to turn back and said, "Would you rather use the porta, since I would rather die than use one of those?" We both reluctantly went inside the bathroom. It was hell. There was trash everywhere, bugs crawling on the walls, and it smelled so bad that we both had to cover our noses. We reluctantly walked to the stalls and each went into one. My stall was somewhat clean looking, but the smell was still terrible. I didn't dare sit on the toilet, so I decided to squat and, do my business. After we were done, we went to wash our hands, but we really didn't want to because the sinks were just as bad as the rest of the bathroom. The sink was stained black and the faucet had mildew all over it. Luckily, I looked in my bag and found some hand sanitizer, but then as we were using it, we heard the door shut. We both immediately went over to open it, but it was locked. We tried calling out to our friends outside, but they couldn't hear us. Cass started panicking, and I tried my best to calm her down. Not even 2 seconds later, she said she had to puke and ran towards the stalls. I hear the stall door creak open, and then Cass screams at the top of her lungs. I went over to see what was going on, and I found her on the floor, curled into a ball and shaking. I asked what was wrong, but she briefly glanced up at the stall door. I opened the door, and what I saw was so shocking that I fell back onto the ground. Inside the stall was a rotting body with ants crawling in and out of the toilet and maggots sprouting from the body. Seeing the body was disturbing, but somehow the stench was even more traumatizing. Suddenly, we heard the door unlock. A police officer walked in, but we didn't take time to greet him. We just immediately ran outside. We explained everything we had seen to him, and later they removed the body and took us home since the body had no identification. It was buried in an unmarked grave. To this day, I still wonder what happened to that guy and who or what locked the door on us. Hi, Wani, I wanted to share my true story with you. I'm 30 years old now, but this happened when I was around 24. My mom and dad decided to move into a newly built house. The house was the first in a row, followed by another set of about 4 houses at the end of our row. There was a giant empty space with a large steep hill. Nothing except extra parking had been built there. This detail will be relevant later. After about a year, my parents ended up separating, and my mom moved out, so it was just me, my dad, and my brother, who was in his last year of college. I had already graduated and was home more often than the two of them. They also had to get up early for school and work, so I would typically be up at night later than them. One night at around 2 o'clock, I went downstairs to get a glass of water from the kitchen to avoid disturbing my family. I decided to use my phone as a flashlight instead of turning on the lights aside from the glow from my phone. The house was really dark. I knew my dad and brother were both asleep in their beds. But when I reached the first landing, I heard someone running from one end of the kitchen to the living room. It was loud. Our house had an open floor plan, and the hardwood floors amplified any noise. Panicked. I quickly ran the rest of the way down the stairs and turned on the lights. But when I looked around, there was no one there. I was confused, but just shrugged it off, got my water, and went back to bed. That wasn't the only incident. A month or two later, I was home alone. I'd spent the day reading and watching videos until I noticed it was getting late, around 6 o'clock in the evening. I texted my dad and brother asking when they'd be home. Both replied they'd be working late. I sighed and continued watching YouTube videos in bed to pass the time. Suddenly, I felt my entire bed shake violently. It wasn't an earthquake. My dresser and bookshelf didn't move. We live near a military base that often does weapons testing, but even that wouldn't have caused my bed to shake so forcefully normally. We just hear noise from the baths. My bed sits on wooden slats, and those slats have fallen before. But when that happens, you can only feel it. If you're sitting on the mattress, this was different. The shaking was visible and could have been seen from anywhere in the room. Freaked out, I called my boyfriend in a panic. To this day, I still don't have an explanation for what happened. The last strange thing that happened before I moved out occurred during the early morning hours. I work at a coffee shop and had to leave around 5 a.m. to open at 5:30 by this time. My stepmom and both of my stepsisters had moved in, so parking in the driveway was crowded. I had to park in the overflow area near the empty space with the steep hill and overgrown bushes. As I was walking to my car, I passed the empty area. Suddenly, I heard someone call my name clear as day. I stopped and looked to my left, but I didn't see anything or anyone, just pitch black. Darkness, terrified. I sprinted the rest of the way to my car and locked the doors as soon as I got inside. Believe me or not, I'm convinced that house is haunted. My dad still lives there, but he says he hasn't had any experiences like I did. True story that took place in 2020. Me and my family went on a trip to Colorado Springs. I can't remember exactly where we went in Colorado Springs, but I do know we went to a desert on a little vacation activity. The desert wasn't as hot as I thought it would be, surprisingly. I could probably survive out there for a few days if I had to. It was quite a long drive. I was about 9 years old at the time, so I was in the seat just sleeping. At one point, my parents woke me up, and to my surprise, there was a desert outside. I asked my mother why we were here, and she said that we were going to look at dinosaur fossilized tracks. I didn't want to complain. We walked into the path leading to a bridge made of sand. My grandfather was teasing me about rattlesnakes, saying that they'll jump and fly at me. That's when I started to get worried at that point. We were walking across this bridge made of sand. It was about 25 to 20 feet tall. I was walking close behind my family when I paused in my tracks to look at the view. Eventually, I began to look down, and in horror, I saw this 7-foot tall humanoid creature. Its skin was as pale as the sand. It seemed as if it was trying to blend into its surroundings. It had a hunched back. It also looked like it hadn't eaten in days. I could see its spine poking out. It walked slowly and quietly. It didn't even seem to notice us. It looked as if it was being drawn to something. I stood there watching it slowly walk 1 foot at a time. My eyes were wide, and what I saw really woke me up. I turned to see that my family were already almost at the end of the bridge. I ran over to catch up. Throughout the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. Of course, I was a child at the time, so I didn't really know how to react, or if I should even tell anyone. I tried to keep my mind on the dinosaur fossils, and I bet my parents were curious as to why I wasn't so fascinated by science. They knew I usually loved science, and anything rocks or fossil, I couldn't even enjoy this, because I was too focused on my sighting and trying to process what to do next. I was born with slow processing, so of course at such a young age you wouldn't really expect someone to see something strange like that. Now I'm older, and I've now figured out it was probably some kind of mythical creature, and from this day on I'll never forget that incident. Allow me to describe the creature a bit more. As I said, it was 7 feet tall. It had this hunchback with its spine poking out. It didn't have long quills, but it did have long arms that almost touched the ground with long scary claws. Its back legs were somewhat like a human and somewhat like a dog too. At the same time, its skin color was as pale as the sand, but a little wider. It walked at a good speed, swinging its arms in the opposite direction of its legs. Just like how a person would walk, it had straight up direct attention of where it was going and didn't even bother to look over at us. I don't think it had ears, which was the strange part. I couldn't really see its face, so I didn't know if it had a nose or not, or what its eyes even looked like. As a side note, I was trying to think of an explanation for what I saw, and was hoping that my mind was simply playing tricks on me. I was thinking that I probably got too much sun, but I realized that we literally just got out of the car, and it would take a while for the sun to get to me. Plus, the sun usually never got to me, never even got a sunburn before. And my mind was thinking the same way if you were seeing an animal for the first time in the wild. So readers or listeners, if you have any ideas to what I saw, please tell me, and I'll look into it to see if it's a perfect match. Not long ago, maybe 1 or 2 months ago, I went through something strange. I sleep in the family living room because there's no TV in my bedroom, and I love watching TV until I fall asleep. I lay out a mattress in front of the TV every night. One night around 12:30 a.m. I hadn't fallen asleep yet. The TV was still playing, and I was chatting with my boyfriend while scrolling on the TikTok from where I sleep. I face my mother's bedroom, but I can't see her bed or her directly, just the wardrobe facing me, the TV cabinet and the wall-mounted TV on the left. On the right, I can only see a small part of my parents' bed that night. I was still giggling while texting my boyfriend. The last thing I heard was my mom's voice as she video called my dad. Not long after that, I heard what sounded like my mom crying. I'm the type of daughter who gets too embarrassed to ask my parents what's wrong or what's going on, so I just lay there quietly listening to the sound of crying. At first I doubted what I was hearing. Is she really crying? What did my dad do this time? I wasn't sure if it was real. I turned the TV volume down and put my phone aside to focus on the sound. As I listened more closely, the crying became clearer. I started to believe that my mom was really crying. Feeling confused, I told my boyfriend right away. I messaged him, "Hey, I hear my mom crying. What should I do?" He insisted that I check on her still. Unsure, I replied, "Are you sure I should check? The crying sounds vague, yet clear." I'm not really sure if she's crying or not, but he kept insisting, so I decided to investigate. I got up from my mattress and walked to the bathroom, which is right beside my mom's bedroom. I didn't go into the bathroom, I just stood near the door to listen more closely. As I stood there, the crying sound became even more apparent. That's when I decided to check on my mom. When I finally looked at her, she was sound asleep. I could tell because she was snoring softly. A chill ran down my spine. What the hell was that crying sound all in my head? I went back to my mattress and texted my boyfriend. My mom is asleep. She wasn't crying. My boyfriend doesn't believe in ghost spirits or anything supernatural, he replied. Maybe we're sleepy and hearing things, but I wasn't sleepy at all. I was wide awake and I had been carefully listening to that crying sound for minutes. There's no way it was just my imagination. Oddly enough, once I returned to my mattress, the crying sound completely stopped. I didn't hear it again. Maybe my mom really was crying earlier, but stopped when I checked on her because she was embarrassed. I thought I decided I would ask her about it in the morning when morning came. I asked her directly, "Mom, were you crying last night?" She looked confused and said no. What I was even more confused, my mom believes in spiritual things like I do, so I told her, "I heard you crying from your bedroom last night." I made sure I wasn't hearing things multiple times, and it sounded so real, but when I checked on you, you were already asleep, and after I went back to my mattress, the sound was gone. My mom was just as shocked as I was. I asked her again to make sure she hadn't been crying. She assured me that if she'd been crying or had a problem with my dad, she would have told me. To this day, I'm still confused about what happened that night. That crying voice sounded so real, there's no way it was just my music imagination. Hi, my name is Emil, and this story happened to me when I was just a little kid. I'm 16 now, so this happened around 2014. Just for some context, I'm a Bosnian who lives in the Swedish city of Buas. I have dark brown hair and bright blue eyes. Okay, now onto the story. When I was 7 years old, my grandma used to watch me and my older brother while our parents were at work. We'd usually play with our toys, go to the playground, or watch a movie, and that's exactly what we did every day for the whole week. My grandma was watching us every day. We would watch one movie before lunch. As we were flipping through our DVDs, we stumbled upon a movie. We had only watched once before. The Cat, the Hat. The movie played as normal, and we actually loved it. As the week went by, we kept watching that exact same movie every day. Since we had gotten bored of the other movies we usually watched, the week had felt fun because of that movie. But little did I know that Friday night would become one of the scariest of my life. That night I dreamt that I was in my apartment. Except it wasn't an apartment, it was a clubhouse, and it belonged to the Cat in the Hat. I had a great time in the clubhouse, partying and eating chips as I was having a good time. I got a bit thirsty and decided to go get a glass of water. When I went to the kitchen to quench my thirst, I found the Cat in the Hat. Sleeping on the kitchen floor, I got my water and was on my way back to the party when I made a huge mistake. I stepped on the cat's tail as I realized what I had done. I saw the cat's face change. His eyes went from being kind and beady to human-shaped, but with the pupils of a real cat, and his smile turned into a long, sharp-toothed frown. Before I could blink, the cat lunged at me, but I managed to dodge him and run into the hall as I was running for my life. I looked back to see if he was still chasing me, and he was. I ran into my parents' bedroom where I realized I was cornered. For some reason, my parents had a can of beans in their room in a desperate last attempt to survive. I grabbed one of the cans and threw it at the Cat in the Hat. His forehead, now cracked open, was leaking blood onto the floor. He stared at me, his eyes widening as he mouthed the words, "I'm coming for you." And just after hearing that, I opened my eyes. I was back in the bunk bed, in my room, my brother peacefully sleeping on the bunk above me. The following week, I was extremely paranoid. I kept hearing rustling in the bushes, hissing sounds outside my window, and I even started seeing black and white figures around me. Except for the paranoia, my life went on as usual until one day, the day that still sends shivers down my spine. Just thinking about it, I was walking to my other grandparents' apartment just as I entered the lobby. The elevator was coming up from the basement. The elevator door had a tall window down the middle of it, so you could see if the elevator was full or get help in case of an accident. As the elevator was going up, I locked eyes with something truly terrifying. On the other side of the elevator window stood the cat, this time without his famous striped hat. But that wasn't the only thing different. He was taller, standing at about 10 feet. He also had a huge grin stretching from ear to ear on his face. I was frozen in place, unable to scream, when the elevator passed the lobby. I bolted out of there and ran all the way back to my apartment. Everyone I told this story to either says I'm lying or that it was just my imagination. And to be honest, I don't blame them. Since the incident, I haven't seen the Cat in the Hat in real life or on TV, and I moved away a few years ago now. Around 9 years later, I've started to believe everyone else, thinking it was all just my imagination. But yesterday, I started hearing a voice in my head saying the Cat in the Hat will make your brain go splat. I'm writing this to get an answer to one question. What was that thing I saw that day? It surely can't be the Cat in the Hand. So what was it, a monster, a demon, or was it something much, much worse?